Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eve Runyon. I am the president and CEO of Pro Bono Institute. Thank you for participating in PBI's first ever virtual conference and for joining us today. PBI has been incredibly fortunate to host Access to Justice stars as keynote speakers throughout our virtual conference. Last week, we were joined by Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison and nonprofit CEO and political leader Stacey Abrams. Today, we have the honor to hear from Kristen Clarke. Kristen is the president and executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, one of the country's most important national civil rights organizations. Under Kristen's leadership, the Lawyers Committee has been at the forefront of some of the nation's biggest racial justice issues: fair housing and community development, economic justice, voting rights, equal education opportunity, criminal justice, and more. Throughout her career, Kristen has focused on work that seeks to strengthen our democracy by combating discrimination faced by Black Americans, people of color, and other marginalized communities. Kristen previously served as the head of the Civil Rights Bureau for the New York State Attorney General's Office, where she led civil rights enforcement matters, including criminal justice issues, education and housing discrimination, barriers to reentry, voting rights, disability rights, just to name a few. When I met Kristen, it was many years ago, she was a busy trial lawyer working at the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. She was also leading a nonprofit organization, helping to lead a nonprofit organization that was focused on HIV and AIDS education prevention in Black communities in Washington, D.C. and in Baltimore. It is accurate to say that Kristen has always been committed to social justice. And with that, I have the great honor of introducing you to my friend and social justice champion, Kristen Clarke. Kristen?
Thank you so much, Eve, for that incredibly warm introduction. It's such an honor and a privilege to be with you for this year's annual Pro Bono Institute conference. So thank you so much for having me. Thank you for your leadership and great work since you've come on board at PBI. I believe the organization has thrived. I want to thank you for the work that you've done to expand the commitment to pro bono work across in-house law departments. Thank you for the work that you've done with the corporate pro bono challenge across the country, which has helped to engage the pro bono services of corporate America in the work that we do in the social justice sector. So thank you just for your great work and commitment, Eve. It's such a privilege to be with you today. I'm honored to be here at this moment. I think that this is an incredible moment for American democracy. No doubt we are living through one of the biggest civil rights movements that we have seen or experienced in generations, and certainly the biggest of this century. This is an unprecedented moment fueled by anger and outrage, combined with human suffering and deepening levels of unemployment that we have faced in the wake of the pandemic, and one also fueled by racism and bias and white supremacy, which are on full display and on screens going viral, both across the country and across the globe. I'm heartened that we will be able to really seize this moment to promote the transformative change that we so desperately need in American democracy. I thought that I would take just a very brief moment to say a brief word about the organization that I lead and just amplify what Eve shared already. This month actually marks the 57th anniversary of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. We were founded in June of 1963 by President John F. Kennedy, who issued a call to action to the private bar, to private lawyers. His charge to them was to figure out how they could use the law to come to the aid of victims of discrimination. The meeting that he convened happened days after the tragic murder of Medgar Evers, a voting rights activist who was killed in his own home in Mississippi. Many of the lawyers who attended that meeting heeded his call. They went back to their home communities and they started to use the law to engage in the civil rights fight. They returned to their small and mid-sized law firm practices. They returned to their big firms in New York and other big cities across the country. But what makes us a unique organization is that we very much draw on pro bono support to carry out our work, defending access to the ballot box, fighting for a fairer criminal justice system, beating back hate crimes, and so much more. I share that history because in many respects, we are a sister organization to the Pro Bono Institute and share across our DNA a deep and abiding commitment to making sure that we are really activating the private bar in our country to leverage their resources and their talents to engage in this critically important work that we all do across the sector. Some observations about the moment that we are in. I have found these conversations difficult to jump into without just taking a moment to pay respect to lives lost. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks. These are people who should be here today, who should be with their families. And my hope is that the loss of these lives will not be in vain, and that we will absolutely find a way to use this moment to bring about the change that we truly need in our country. At the Lawyers Committee, we have been working on overtime, confronting not just the racial justice challenges that we face in the wake of the pandemic, which has exposed the ways in which racism impacts virtually every aspect of society, particularly access to healthcare in our country. But now we are also dealing with the opportunity that's opened up in the wake of the tragic deaths of these African-American individuals. We were thrilled to see the House of Representatives last week pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which would put in place comprehensive A to Z reform of policing, which we so direly need in our country. My hope is that we will see this bill gain traction in the Senate. My hope is that we will continue to see states and cities undertake deep work at the grassroots level to bring about change in the justice system and change in policing that we truly need to turn the tide. And I think that all of this work is important to note because it creates opportunities for lawyers to really plug in and provide support to lawmakers, officials, and activists who are trying to figure out how we can make our justice system better, more equitable, and reform policing in a way that produces safer outcomes for communities. Some of the work that we're also doing is confronting the ways in which voter suppression has intensified in the wake of the current health pandemic. Voter suppression was alive and well pre-pandemic. We have been contending with the fallout from the US Supreme Court's devastating ruling issued in 2013 in a case called Shelby County, Alabama versus Holder, which sadly has emboldened officials across our country to put in place unnecessary, burdensome, and discriminatory rules that make it harder for people to vote. This month actually marks the 7th anniversary since the Supreme Court issued that ruling, which basically brought to a grinding halt a core mechanism in the Voting Rights Act, a federal review mechanism that required that states like Texas and Georgia, North and South Carolina, Florida, and other states with very long and egregious histories of voting discrimination to get federal review of voting changes before they could be put into effect. And without that federal review process, states and localities have raced forward with efforts intended to make it harder for people to vote, reducing polling sites from the dozens to just a handful, moving polling sites to hostile locations, putting in place burdensome government-issued ID requirements, which make it very hard for people on the margins, particularly low-income communities of color, to vote. On top of that, you now have a pandemic which has really upended elections across our country and made it harder for people to vote. We are working hard to beat back officials who are using the pandemic as a pretext to make it more difficult for people to exercise voice in our democracy. We're fighting in states like Tennessee, for example, where officials have said that fear of contracting the pandemic is not a legitimate basis to get access to an absentee ballot. We're fighting in states like Pennsylvania, where you have hostile efforts and lawsuits being filed, not just there, but in many parts of the country, that are all about restricting access to absentee ballots this season. So a tremendous amount of work to do to safeguard access to democracy this season. The other important work that we're engaged in at this moment is making sure that people who are out peacefully exercising their First Amendment right to speak out, to demonstrate, and to protest are able to do so freely. We filed a lawsuit along with the Washington Lawyers Committee and the ACLU of DC to protect and stand up for peaceful American citizens who were assaulted in Lafayette Square in Washington, DC several weeks ago. They were out standing in front of the St. John's Historic Church in Lafayette Square, just steps from the White House. You had children out there, veterans, Black, white, brown, people of different religious backgrounds who were there with one singular objective: calling out racial injustice and calling for policing reform. When the Trump administration descended and our Attorney General, Barr, ordered that violence be used to disperse the crowd. It was a very ugly and grim scene. We have clients who were assaulted. There were rubber bullets fired at the crowd, tear gas. People were assaulted with batons. We're in DC District Court fighting that case right now, along with our pro bono partners. But no doubt, protecting and standing up for the First Amendment, which is under assault in so many parts of the country right now, is critically important work to safeguarding the health of our democracy. I am, despite the challenges, immensely hopeful about the future. I think that we have a unique and unprecedented opportunity in front of us to, again, harness the anger that so many communities are feeling to promote change at every level, not just inside the Beltway, but really thinking about change at the grassroots level, at the local level, that can help to make our communities safer and more whole. I also think that it's important for us to be reminded that as lawyers, we stand uniquely positioned to promote change and reform, but we're not going to do it on our own. The work of the activists, the protesters who are marching in the streets and keeping a bright light shining on the victims of police violence, and who are issuing a clarion call for reform, are an incredibly part of the multidimensional civil rights movement that is underway right now. This is a battle that will be fought inside and outside the courtrooms. And so I believe deeply that we as lawyers stand uniquely positioned to help really bring about reform and change. But I also think it's important for us to be reminded that lawyers can't do this work on their own. I'll close by just noting the moment from the 60s in which my organization came about, in the heyday of the civil rights movement. I think about moments like Bloody Sunday in 1965, where peaceful demonstrators were marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and brutally assaulted and met with violence at the hands of local law enforcement. And I think that while we've made great progress in our nation, in many respects, that progress has been fragile. And in many respects, so many of the problems that we are living through and seeing today bear remarkable resemblance to the challenges and issues that we were up against in the 1960s. We've made progress, but there's still so much work to be done to really make our democracy a fair, open, and equitable one for all communities. Eve, thank you very much for having me today. Look forward to an exchange with all of you now. Thank you, Eve.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing remarks, providing your perspective, and talking to us about these really important, difficult issues. We are now going to open up the program up to Q&As, and we invite you to use the Q&A prompt that is on your screen. We have limited time, so we may not get to all of the questions. And we also have questions that were submitted in advance. And so I'm going to start with one of those questions. Kristen, you talked about voter suppression, and last week we had Stacey Abrams who joined us and talked about voter suppression, what she's seeing in Georgia, what her organization is doing. From your perspective, what are the biggest concerns surrounding the 2020 elections, and what concrete steps can we take as pro bono lawyers, whether we're at an in-house department at a law firm or legal services organizations? What steps can we do to address some of those concerns?
Yeah, this is work that keeps me up at night because the challenges that we are seeing and experiencing when it comes to access to the ballot box are intense and profound and growing by the day. There's actually elections underway right now in a handful of states. And one of the ways in which lawyers can get involved is through a program that we lead at the Lawyers Committee called Election Protection. Election protection came about 20 years ago after Bush v. Gore. After Bush v. Gore, we really saw the nation's consciousness awaken around threats that voters experience at the ballot box, about the breaks in the system. And we believe deeply that it was important to create a nonpartisan place and space for people to report issues, report complaints, report breakdowns in the system. The election protection program is anchored by thousands of lawyers who volunteer for the program and work that we do. It's anchored by a hotline, 866 Our Vote, that's available to anyone across the country, from Hawaii to New York to Florida, regardless of your partisan affiliation. We work to troubleshoot and resolve the problems that voters experience. We work to pull people back from the brink of disenfranchisement. We are running election protection today, and we'll go through the night. Our goal is making sure that everyone has voice in our democracy. Sometimes the problems that we learn about through election protection program are not ones where we troubleshoot it with respect to one person and move forward. Sometimes we're hearing about true breaks in the system that warrant systemic litigation. So sometimes the work results in us going into court on election day to extend polling hours. Sometimes the work that we do will result in lawsuits, which we are exploring right now in places where we have seen particular jurisdictions reject absentee ballots at alarmingly high and unusual levels. So it's a great program. It is about making sure that we have a level playing field when it comes to voting in our country and making sure that everyone can vote. So one thing I would encourage folks to do, if interested, is to visit our website at 866ourvote.org, 866ourvote.org, and find out how you can volunteer today. An incredibly important program that will no doubt be busy at every turn this season.
That's fantastic. And there's another program that I think might be of interest to folks on the line. A lot of what firms and companies are doing in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and this focus on racial justice is bring in training for their own employees, their own staff, whether it's within the legal department or the company as a whole, that's focused on things like implicit bias and microaggressions and cultural competency, which is especially important for our pro bono lawyers that are providing services to people of color and marginalized communities. The Lawyers Committee has a legal education program, which I think is really interesting because it strikes me that one of the things that's really important, especially for pro bono lawyers, is not just cultural competency, but really understanding sort of the history of some of these systemic challenges and having education around these different policies and practices that have oppressed for so many years. So can you talk a little bit about that program?
Yeah. The program takes many forms. We will do 101, CLE programming on voting rights and outline for corporations and law firms, what is the kind of current landscape with respect to voting rights, and what are the threats that we're seeing today, and how are lawyers intervening in that space. We have a great program that we have done focused on criminal histories, educating employers about the importance of employing people with criminal histories and helping to overcome and address some of the myths and misconceptions that folks sometimes have about people with criminal backgrounds, and talking about why this work is really important to ensure that people are getting a second chance in society, to ensure that we're providing, in the most lawful sense, equal and fair opportunity to all. And then many training programs around implicit bias and working with corporations and law firms to strengthen their diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. So I think that's an area for us to deepen our partnership. I think that now in 2020, this is important work for so many corporations and law firms to be engaged with.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I was also excited to hear about the George Floyd Policing Act, and I'm hopeful that that will move forward. There's been a lot of focus on policing, and there's a cry to defund the police. Can you talk a little bit about that and your sense as to whether that's the right approach with regard to police reform?
Yeah, so I'm gonna answer that in a way that kind of takes us back. So in the civil rights movement, we had Martin Luther King, we had Malcolm X, we had Rosa Parks, we had the Black Panthers. And frankly, all of those voices were really critical, and all of those voices and the different ideologies that they brought to bear provided a nice healthy push and pull, a nice healthy level of agitation that I really think helped to make the civil rights movement what it was: incredibly dynamic, incredibly agitative, and very much focused on moving the country forward. I should also mention we had our Thurgood Marshalls and our Constant Baker Motleys as well. Now today we do have this growing cry for defunding the police, and folks who are also calling for the abolition of police. I think those voices are important, and I don't think those voices should be silenced. It's not a position that I agree with, but I think that needs to be a part of the conversation that we're having right now about how we can confront head on the policing crisis that we have faced in our country for decades. My own personal view is that we should be exploring ways to defund aspects of policing in our country. We have become too accustomed to relying on armed law enforcement officers for far too much in our country. I think about Tatyana Jefferson, a Black woman who was killed in her own home last fall in Dallas, Texas. Her neighbor made a social welfare check call. He was very clear: I'm not making an emergency call, but I noticed that my neighbor's door is open and wondered if you can go and check on her. They send out a trigger-happy armed law enforcement officer who fired one bullet through a window and killed her dead with her young nephew present while they're just home on a Friday night. If we defunded aspects of policing in that department and instead had social workers or a non-armed individual who could have gone out to make that social welfare check, a Tatyana Jefferson would be alive today. I think about Eric Garner, accused of selling a loose cigarette. I think about Alton Sterling in Louisiana, accused of selling CDs out of his trunk. I think about George Floyd, allegedly accused of having a counterfeit $20 bill. Query whether for those kinds of low-level, nonviolent alleged offenses, we really needed to deploy armed officers trained to kill to those interactions. If we defunded policing in our country and made investments in other services, I think all of those people would be alive today. So that's where I come down on this view, but I also just believe deeply that we need not shut down the wide range of voices that are calling for reform right now, because there is a single unifying objective at the end of all of this: having a more just society.
Yeah, I very much appreciate that perspective, and I appreciate sort of looking at sort of historically what we saw in the civil rights movement and the tension that exists between different leaders, different groups, and the value that was produced from that. Another thing that we're seeing a lot are cries to bring down Confederate leader statutes and to change schools and the names of schools and the names of streets. How important do you think it is that the United States own up to its past before it can fully cure injustices?
Yeah. We haven't had the real conversations that we need to have, right? I mean, I think, even for the corporate and legal sector, we're kind of comfortable with concepts of implicit bias, right? And cultural competency, which are incredibly important, but we need to get comfortable also talking about racism and white supremacy and, some of the ugliest aspects of our nation's history. I stand with communities that are calling for the removal of these Confederate statutes, which harken back to the days of slavery, harken back to the days of Jim Crow, which elevate and celebrate people who were pro-slavery and pro the use of violence as a tool to silence, repress, if not kill, Black people in our country. I think that some of the movement that we see underway to shine a light on the things that we celebrate and the things that we don't is an important part of this kind of full conversation we're having right now about how we move our country to a better place. We need more statues for the Martin Luther Kings and the Rosa Parks. It was remarkable to see last weekend that Princeton University has agreed to strip Woodrow Wilson's name off of its policy school. My son goes to Woodrow Wilson High School here in Washington, D.C., and even the students at his school are engaged in a very vigorous debate about whether that name should stay up or come down. I think these are conversations that we need to have. And I think that we need to be and feel uncomfortable when we're having these conversations. So thank you for raising that issue. I also think about our courthouses and the ways in which these Confederate statues and monuments may leave communities feeling like equal justice is not a real, tangible, concept in their communities. So I hope that our courthouses will also be a part of the conversation and movement that's underway here.
Thank you. I'm mindful of time, and we only have a couple of minutes left. You have worked on racial and social justice issues throughout your career. What advice do you have for pro bono lawyers at firms, companies, and legal services organizations, and what ask do you have of this community?
Well, we need more civil rights lawyers, more social justice lawyers on the front lines of this work, right? If there's one thing that is clear, is that civil rights organizations and the public interest sector isn't going out of work anytime soon. There's so much work to be done to truly address the problems right in front of us. There is so much work to be done in terms of just clean up from the last 3-4 years, which have been incredibly challenging in terms of the reversals that we've seen on civil rights gains. We've got work to do to re-diversify the courts once the world is normal again. We've lost ground with respect to racial and gender diversity of our federal courts, and I think that is deeply problematic and leaves communities feeling that they are served by courts that don't dispense justice equitably. So I encourage people who have an interest in this work to find an organization to grab onto and to hold. If you're at a law firm, find an organization that you can build deep partnerships with when it comes to social justice work, because it's a marathon, it's not a sprint, right? We do this work, we get a win one day, and tomorrow we're, facing down the barrel of an appeal, and then you got the possibility of the Supreme Court at the end of it all. So find an organization to hold on to. If you're at a corporation in-house, same thing. Find an organization to build deep partnership with. And if you're not at a corporation or a law firm, volunteer inside the sector and get to know up close and in a personal way the work that we do.
So Kristen, you shared that you do have a couple of more minutes, which is fantastic, because I do have a couple of more questions. So if you could stick with us a little bit, that would be great. We have a question. Someone in particular is interested in learning about reentry. And we talked about educating employers around structural racism, systemic racism, in addition to implicit bias and cultural competency training. For folks who are interested in particular in reentry issues, do you have advice as to where you can go to learn more about this and how you can get involved in these issues? I know this is some of the work that you did in New York.
Yeah, so when I started at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law about 4.5 years ago, my very first initiative was figuring out how we can deepen our work when it comes to giving people with criminal opportunities a second chance, giving people with criminal histories a second chance. And it impacted every aspect of our work: voting rights, education, fair housing, voting rights. In every aspect of our work, there was something to be done. There are states that still impose barriers on people with criminal histories. There are landlords that we are suing right now that have policies of barring people with arrest and or criminal records from occupying their units. There are employers, many of whom harbor just a lack of awareness, who refuse to give opportunities to people with criminal histories. There are colleges and universities that, until a moment of reform a few years ago through the College Board, were asking student applicants to disclose their arrest and or criminal histories on their college application forms. So this is an area where there is just a lot of work to do. Licensing restrictions is another big issue. States that will deny people the right to get a license to serve as a barber or as a hairdresser or to cut lawns if you have criminal histories. It is remarkable, just the lack of awareness and the profound discrimination and barriers that people face. You can learn more by visiting our website, and I'm trying to think of another organization that does really great comprehensive work in this space. I may have to circle back with you to give you one or two good ones, but so much work to be done in this space.
Yeah, we can definitely share that information with our attendees. And I love that you said when you started at the Lawyers Committee a number of years ago, there was a recognition of how reentry touches every aspect of what Lawyers Committee works on. And one of the things that I think is important, especially for the pro bono community to think through, and so there are initiatives that we're involved in that, whether it's clemency or other things that are related to the pandemic, where folks are being released early, and I worry that that we're not thinking through all of the challenges that individual may face, and that we're focusing on release, but we're not focusing on reentry. We're not focusing on whether that person has identification, whether that person has a job, whether that person has housing, and that's really an important part of thinking through the entire continuum of the delivery of legal services. And so I love the fact that the Lawyers Committee is looking at these issues comprehensively and is thinking through not just housing, but housing as it relates to different sectors and different communities. So that's fantastic. One thing I do want to ask, so we've talked a little bit about criminal justice reform and voting. The Lawyers Committee also focuses on education and economic empowerment. To the extent that we're looking at systemic reform in these areas, what is it that you're focused on? Where is it that you think that additional resources, additional time and treasure could bring some real change as it relates to some of those other issues?
There's just no shortage. There are all of the pandemic challenges that we're up against right now, right? How do we deal with students who are on the other side of the digital divide, who are not getting equitable access to the virtual classroom in this era? And the summer has given school districts a chance to catch their breath and figure out how to get it right for the fall. But I think that this is an area where school districts could benefit from the help of lawyers to help them think through these issues. How do we meet the needs of students with disabilities and so forth? I think that similarly, there are profound issues in the criminal justice context. We're seeing overcrowded conditions in jails and prisons and lack of political will for officials to modify their policies and release people who may be nonviolent, low-level offenders to help ease overcrowding in jails. And some of that work has, involved going into court and suing because it's hard to get actors to do the right thing voluntarily. So there are no shortage of kind of pandemic-related questions and threats that we're up against. On the education front, I'll just note 3 cases that we're involved with that are somewhat below the radar, but if you're someone who cares about diversity, equity, and inclusion, then you have to care about these cases. And this is a next set of cases challenging affirmative action. There's a case that has been brought challenging race-conscious admissions efforts at Harvard University, another involving the University of North Carolina, and a third involving the University of Texas at Austin. These are cases fueled and funded by the same individual, Ed Bloom, a former hedge fund manager who also financed the Texas Fisher case several years ago. He is bent on getting these cases before the US Supreme Court. And we're the only organization involved in all 3 of those cases, which I think have enormous implications for the country, have enormous implications, not just for diversity on those 3 campuses, but on diversity efforts at colleges and universities generally and broadly, and have enormous implications for the law firms and corporations that are focused on building diverse pipelines. As these cases move forward, we'll need the voices of corporations and law firms speaking up that diversity is important, that it's important that we have diverse college campuses that are producing diverse talent to help ensure that they on the back end have diverse pipelines of talent to tap into. So I just want to put a pin in those cases because they're just about the most important cases that I think are out there and not getting a lot of attention right now.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. And again, you're very kind to give us an extra 10 minutes. And so I do want to be respectful and I'll let you go. But this has been a fantastic conversation, Kristen. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing the work of your organization. Thank you for sharing your perspective. Thank you for sharing opportunities for us to get involved. We look forward to continuing this conversation with you. And we wish you and your organization the best of luck in the coming works. It is hard work, but it is God's work. And so thank you so much for your time.
Oh, it's an honor and a privilege to be with you today. Thank you for your leadership and the great work that you do, and looking forward to finding ways to partner with PBI to help make our democracy a more just and equitable place. So thank you.
Have a great day.